Well, thank you. Thank you for organizing this event. Also, someone do me a favor. I would like, if possible, because I do want to leave more time for discussion. Sven, could I ask you, if you have a timekeeping device, to let me know when I've gotten to 20 minutes, because I really don't want to talk. If I can keep it to 20 minutes, that would be ideal. So that we'll have time for a bunch of time for discussion. And so what I want to talk about is not specifically the norms of rationality or reasonableness, but rather the targets of those norms. What sorts of things they are that get evaluated as rational or reasonable. In fact, I think that the most fundamental challenge to any form of consequentialism is not that it fails to respect the difference between persons or whatever, but rather that it fails to account for why the targets of normative evaluation are what they are, why they're intentions and not appetites, why they're, in the epistemological case, why they're beliefs and not sensations. So what I want to talk about today is just the targets of evaluation in terms of rationality or reasonableness. And I'll start by asking you all to consider these two lists that I've written up on this paper. So on the left-hand side, I've written a list of 4 different things. If you can't read them, I'll read them to you. So this is conspiring to assassinate the minister, inferring from recent employment data that wages will soon rise, resenting the passerby who carelessly pushed me on the street, or fearing a nuclear attack. Okay, so there's a list of a bunch of different things: conspiring, inferring, resenting, fearing. Now on the right-hand list, I've also listed some different things. Suffering from tinnitus, the ringing in the ear that you get, especially after a loud concert. Having an itch on one's elbow. Feeling tired. Or bumping into a hot stove. I used bumping into to indicate that this is unintentional. It was like, I could have said, tripping over a stick or something like that. I take it that everything on the left-hand list is an obvious case of something that's evaluable as rational or irrational. And everything on the right-hand list is an obvious case of something that's not evaluable as rational or irrational. So I take that to be obvious. I'm not going to argue for it. If anyone wants to challenge it, I welcome the challenge. But the question is why? What separates the things on the left-hand list and makes them subject to rational evaluation and distinguishes them from the things on the right-hand list that aren't subject to rational evaluation? Well, okay, here's some obviously wrong answers that we'll start by going through, saying why they're obviously wrong. Well, the things on the left-hand list are voluntary, the things on the right-hand list are not voluntary. Okay, obviously wrong. Fearing a nuclear attack is not voluntary. Of course, I could do something voluntarily to induce in myself a fear, but fearing itself is not voluntary. Neither is resenting, and I'd say neither is inferring. Obviously false candidate number 2, the things on the left-hand list are intentional, things on the right-hand list are not. Once again, that's not true. Resenting typically isn't intentional, neither is fearing. And neither is, typically at least, neither is inferring. Let's see, obviously false candidate number 3. The things on the left-hand list are actions, the things on the right-hand list are not. Well, that's not right because bumping into a hot stove is an action. Not an intentional action, of course, but as we just said, not everything on the left-hand list is an intentional action. So that's not right either. So you can't appeal to voluntariness, to what's intentional, to what's active. Notice also that the metaphysical categories of the things on this list differ widely. So for instance, fearing and resenting are states. Inferring is an event. Conspiring is an event. Conspiring and inferring are events of two different kinds. Inferring is the kind of event that Aristotle would have called an activity. It's the sort of thing which is such that once you're doing it, it follows that you've done it. Actually, that's true of conspiring as well, occurs to me. But it's not true of everything that ought to go on the left-hand list. It's just a defect of the list as I composed it, that I included only activities and not processes. Like a process being something like walking across the street, right? You can, just because you are walking across the street, it doesn't follow that you've walked across the street. Okay, so the metaphysical categories differ between events and states along both of the lists, right? So it's not some distinctive metaphysical category. It's not their relation to time, for instance, that distinguishes the items on the left-hand list from the items on the right-hand list. Okay, well, is it the fact that the items on the right-hand list are somehow all somatic, right? Suffering from tinnitus, having to do with the ringing in the ears, the elbows. But, you know, the items on the left-hand list are also in some cases somatic, right? Someone pushed you. You resent them. You stand in a certain relation to them, which is partly constituted by your somatic relation to them. You resent them for having pushed you. You can only resent someone for having pushed you if they pushed you. So, we can't appeal to the condition of being somatic either to distinguish the items on the left-hand list from the items on the right-hand list. What about the way we know about these things? Sidney Shoemaker pointed out that many of these conditions are conditions that we know ourselves to be in, or can, at any rate, know ourselves to be in a way that's immune to error through misidentification. But that's also true of the conditions on the right-hand list. And if I know that I'm suffering from tinnitus, at least if I know it in the normal way, it's not that I know someone is suffering from tinnitus and then I think, oh, it must be me. It's rather, I know I'm suffering from tinnitus. So my knowledge is immune to error through misidentification. Similarly, my knowledge is non-observational, as Anscombe would say. It's knowledge without observation. So we can't appeal to those conditions of how we know these things in order to distinguish the items on the left-hand list from the items on the right-hand list. Well, I've gone through all of the obviously false candidates that come to my mind. So now let me turn to what I think is a right answer, but requires clarification. So the right answer is, in all of these cases, in all of the cases on the left-hand side, when you occupy that condition, you are sticking your neck out in a certain way and opening yourself up, making yourself vulnerable to criticism. A Salarzian might say that you're undertaking a commitment when you occupy one of the conditions on the left-hand side, but not when you occupy one of the conditions on the right-hand side. But what does that mean And is that just a restatement of the phenomenon? After all, the phenomenon that we're trying to explain is the fact that these things are accessible for rationality and these are not. Well, if I say what explains why these things are accessible for rationality is that when you're in one of those conditions, you're sticking your neck out and rendering yourself vulnerable to criticism, then you might think, well, of course, because you're accessible for rationality. And so what are you doing here other than just restating the phenomenon that you're allegedly trying to explain? So you might worry that this, answer that I've given is no answer at all. It's just a restatement of the phenomenon. And so far, I think that's right. But let me say a little more. How much time? Just
10 minutes.
Okay, great. All right, that'll be just enough time. So let me say a little more. Each one of these conditions is such that to be in the condition involves having a bunch of dispositions to act or think or feel in various ways. I mean, this is the truth that I think gets distorted in machine state functionalism of the 1960s. The idea that these conditions are nothing but a bunch of dispositions to think and act and feel in certain ways. I don't want to say that, right? There are familiar Kripkensteinian problems with that, but they do involve dispositions to think and act and feel in various ways. But we can distinguish the items on the right-hand side of the board from the items on the left-hand side of the board by virtue of the relation that they bear to the dispositions that they involve. In particular, the items on the left-hand side of the board, conspiring to assassinate the minister, or resenting the passerby who carelessly pushed me on the street. They involve dispositions, right? So I resent the passerby who carelessly pushed me on the street. I might, utter some execrations, or, if I see him again, maybe, just trip him or something like that. I mean, who knows exactly? But some such dispositions. But it's not just that they involve those dispositions, but they involve being disposed to do those things, being disposed to utter those execrations, or to, trip the offending passerby. In light of the fact that he carelessly pushed me on the street. That's to say, the dispositions that are involved in these conditions are dispositions that are not just caused by those conditions, they're dispositions that I have in light of those conditions. Or, to use the word that Carl used so fortuitously in his talk yesterday, they're dispositions that are guided by these conditions. Right? So my resentment guides me in uttering execrations or tripping the passerby. My fear guides me in being sure to vote in the midterm elections. And, well, I don't know, what do you do when you're afraid of a nuclear? I don't know what you do when you're afraid of a nuclear attack. But in any case, it guides me in some respects or other. Donating money to political candidates, or, doing whatever sadly ineffective forms of activism I'm still capable of. Yeah, conspiring, yes, exactly. That's right.
That's not on tape.
So, but what does that amount to say that the dispositions are not just caused by the condition, they're dispositions that I have in light of the condition. They're dispositions that are guided by the condition. Okay, that's a big topic. It's a topic I've talked about elsewhere, and I'm not going to summarize. I'm not going to rehearse my arguments here, but I'll just offer a hypothesis here. To say that the dispositions involved in these conditions are dispositions that I have in light of those conditions, dispositions that are guided by those conditions, is to say not just that the dispositions are caused by the conditions, but that the conditions determine the form. They determine the conditions of individuation of those dispositions. They're what Aristotle would have called the formal cause of those dispositions. Here's another way that I can make the same point. The dispositions that are involved in these conditions are dispositions to act or think or feel in various ways, where those exercises of the disposition, those very exercises are constituted by my representation of those exercises as rational. My de se representation of those exercises as rational. In contrast, with these conditions, while I might mistakenly represent some of them as rational, right? My friend Susanna Siegel does. While I might mistakenly represent some of them as rational, that representation, even if it were de se, still wouldn't determine the form of the dispositions that I'm caused to have by virtue of being in one of these conditions. So these conditions cause me to have various dispositions, but the dispositions they cause me to have are not dispositions whose form is determined by those conditions. So these conditions are, you could say, efficient causes of the dispositions that are involved in being in those conditions. Whereas these conditions are formal causes of the dispositions that are involved in those conditions. They determine the form of the disposition, and they do so in this way. The disposition involved in one of these conditions is a disposition to act or think or feel to act or think or feel in a way that's constituted by a de se representation of that very acting or thinking or feeling as rational. So this is a kind of guise of the good thesis, generalized. This is why I was afraid of Carl's talk yesterday. This is a guise of the good thesis, generalized to all of those conditions that are rationally accessible. So all of the conditions that are rationally accessible, the conditions that belong on this list, have that in common. They're formal causes of the dispositions involved in those conditions. They determine the form of those dispositions, and specifically the form of those dispositions are to be disposed to act, think, or feel in ways that you represent de se as rational. Okay, so that's the generalization of the guise of the good thesis to all of these conditions. Okay. Zoe raises a lot of good questions about how to understand this thesis, and so I think, because I want to leave time for discussion, why don't I turn to her questions, and then I'll say a little bit about her questions, and then I want to address whatever questions you all have. Okay?